time to get a campaign update by the numbers now. David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data and a frequent contributor here on CPAC to help us make sense of the campaign, looking at the issues, the announcements, and the promises based on what public opinion is telling us. David, good to see you again. Thanks for being here. So we have these massive climate marches across the country today, and clearly climate's an issue with young people. So how big of an issue is this with the general voting public?
Well, right now in our tracking, it is the number 3 issue. 42% of Canadians tell us it's one of the top 5 issues that will determine their vote. And so it's more important than a lot of issues that have been discussed in the campaign so far and that other Canadians are thinking about. And your point about, is it just young people? It's not just young people. Young people are more engaged on this issue. There's an intensity to their concern about it that maybe is different than older Canadians, but across the board, I think there's not only recognition that this is a problem, but I think a growing recognition, right? 42%, a similar number says climate change is an emergency in a survey we did earlier this year. And so I think there's a broad recognition, not only that it's an important issue, but for a large number of Canadians, it may come down to, it's a starting point to how they'll evaluate the parties and the leaders in making their choice.
Just going to say on this notion of can it move a needle in an election campaign, and I guess issues can, in terms of how they crop up, how the parties deal with them. So you see a big demonstration, a series of demonstrations like this. You see the parties all trying to respond to it. It's the story of the day. Does that have the potential to then, frame how they do their campaigning and what they talk about?
I think so, and I think it's like today, because it's going to get so much coverage. It could be one of those events that pivots the campaign, right? Campaigns are it's not as long as the American elections, but they're still long. There's a lot of days, and not all Canadians are paying attention every single day to every single thing that happens. But there will be moments when people will tune in and it might frame the way that they assess it. Also, don't underestimate the impact of young people going home to their parents or their grandparents and having conversations about this, right? And the impact that has. Right. So I'm not saying this election,
generational gap, if there
exactly,
is one.
not that this election will be about climate change, but events like this, which is why they hold them, might raise that issue further up the agenda, and at the very least are getting most of the party leaders today talking about it.
Right, some new numbers to talk about today, and just before we get to them, let's look at the methodology. What do we need to know?
Yeah, so we surveyed almost 2,000 Canadians. We went in the field Monday, we finished Thursday morning, and so this is very fresh numbers representative of the country, conducted online.
Okay, let's look at what we call the horse race numbers, because we'll start there, but we won't stay there. Yeah. What's the story? What are we seeing?
Well, we're actually seeing in our numbers for the first time since May 2019, the Liberals numerically ahead of the Conservatives in our national polls. They're up 3 points from the survey that we completed over the weekend, and so we've been doing more regular surveys. They're at 35% nationally. The Conservatives are at 33%, only down 1. So not a huge amount of movement, but movement, and at least in our surveys, that kind of go counter perhaps to the narrative that the blackface photos and some of the stuff that's happened in the campaign might be hurting the Liberals. At the national level, we don't see a lot of evidence that the Liberals are suffering. In fact, there's some indication perhaps that they've got a little bit of momentum right now in our polling anyway.
And some of that might show up when we break down the vote intention by region. What do we see?
Well, we see most of the movement from one week to the next in our polling has happened in Ontario, where the Liberals now have a 7-point lead over the Conservatives. That's in line with some of the other polling that we've seen. The Liberals continue to do well in Quebec. We don't see the sort of spike in bloc numbers that are happening. They're doing well. They're at 20% in Quebec, but the NDP, the Greens, they're still well back in single digits, but the Liberals have a big lead there. Atlantic Canada solid for the Liberals, the Prairie solid for the Conservatives, and as it's been for some time, BC remains very competitive. In fact, more competitive with multiple parties, not just the Liberals or the Conservatives in play. And so that helps explain the move in the national numbers.
Okay, let's look at impressions of the leaders. Let's start with Justin Trudeau. A little better week.
A little better week. Obviously people reacted somewhat negatively to those photos that appeared last week. His numbers, his negatives went up, his positives went down. They've turned slightly back towards each other. But he's still in a position in which more people view him negatively than positively. But that trend line is so flat, it's really interesting that people who have an opinion of him in one way or the other don't seem to be moving much, which we should expect because he's the leader that most people know of, they're most familiar with, so it's much harder to move opinions about him.
And what about the impressions of the Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer? This could be a bit of an issue.
This is an issue. I think as more people seem to be getting to know him over the campaign, fewer people are liking him, more people view him negatively. That's not the right direction, I think, if you're Mr. Scheer trying to obviously appeal to more Canadians. Again, given this is in context to everything else that's happened around him, it doesn't seem yet that the Conservatives are taking advantage of any vulnerabilities or weakness that the Liberals might be showing because of some things that the Prime Minister did certainly 20 years ago that are shocking Canadians to some extent.
So if Andrew Scheer might not be happy with the impressions people have of him, he's probably happy that people are building a better impression of Jagmeet Singh. Because he wants Jagmeet Singh to do better than he's doing to be competitive against Justin Trudeau. So if Justin Trudeau had a better week, Jagmeet Singh's had a pretty good week.
Had a good week. We rarely see these kind of spikes that we saw. And, last week we saw his numbers go down, his positives go down, which kind of, in a way, was counterintuitive given, the attention he got in response to the photos of Mr. Trudeau. But this week we do see a nice bounce up for Mr. Scheer. Now, clearly more people view him positively than negatively. Again, is this a trend? I don't know. We need more data to know that, but it's certainly better news for Mr. Singh after what has been, I think, a difficult campaign for the NDP to get any attention.
And speaking of attention, how much attention are people paying to the campaign?
Interestingly,
you got some numbers about interest, right?
Yeah, there's sizable interest in an election campaign, but we have numbers before the campaign, just as the campaign was starting, and today, and remarkably, they're incredibly consistent. They're exactly the same. About half the country says they are following it closely. About a third say they're following it somewhat, and then there's a very small group who say they're not really following it at all. That is unchanged. So we are still at the stage of this campaign where people are engaged, but we haven't yet reached that kind of full engagement. And if we do reach it, it's not likely going to happen for another few weeks, I don't think. But so not everything that happens on the campaign yet is being really noticed by most Canadians.
All right, this next slide, voter universes. Explain what we're seeing here.
So the voter universe is the full number of people who say they're open to voting for each of these parties. So the numbers at the top of that slide suggest that 46% of Canadians say they would be open to voting Conservative. Now, the way to look at a campaign also is these parties have converted some of that support. That's the horse race number. What percentage of people say they would vote Liberal or Conservative? The number above, or that group above, are the potential. And what this shows, first of all, is all the parties still have lots of room potentially to grow between now and Election Day. Certainly the Greens and the NDP have the biggest room to grow because they've converted fewer of their potential supporters. But it shows the Liberals have the highest ceiling, right? 52% say they would be open to voting for the Liberal Party. All this really, the big story here is we know what the horse race is today. It may not be what the horse race is, a week or 2 weeks from now, because there's a lot of Canadians who are still open to voting for a party other than the one they'd say they vote for today.
All right. This next slide helps us, and we're hearing less and less of it now on the campaign trail, but the whole brown blackface controversy and Justin Trudeau, what are you finding? Well,
we've been tracking this, and as of yesterday, it's almost universally known that the story was out there, and that's a very fast pace in which almost 94% of Canadians said they've heard at least something about this story. 65%, up 11 points from our last survey, say they've heard a lot about it. So this story has broken through. The question that still lingers in a lot of people's minds is it going to matter? And when we ask people how it will affect their vote, if it will at all, the numbers really haven't moved much. 10% say they're reconsidering their support for the Liberals as a result of this, which in a close election as it is, could be meaningful. But the vast majority of Canadians say either I'm not voting Liberal anyway, or this is not going to really affect my vote.
Okay, so when you look at this information and you look at the polling universe this week, because you're looking beyond your own numbers for us, what can you tell us about where we are in week 3? What's the story here?
Well, I think we're still seeing the parties trying to, lots of policy announcements this week. I think you're right, a pivot away from last week's events around those photos, an increased focus on climate change, but still voters not fully engaged in the election. Not a lot of movement happening, some improvement for the Liberals, but really just outside the margin of error. And so I still think most Canadians are in a holding pattern here. They're waiting to hear more. They're maybe not fully engaged. And the big thing that, as we finish this week and we look to next week and then headed into the debates is, what is this campaign really about still? I don't think it's
been
clear.
Defined yet. Eh?
I don't think voters know what the ballot question is. And ultimately, they're really still gauging and assessing their options, right? They have clear views on Mr. Trudeau, But what we're learning now is, as they get to know the other opposition leaders more closely, how are they reacting to it? The bad news for Mr. Scheer is more people are reacting negatively. The good news this week is for Mr. Singh, maybe they're giving him a second look. And we won't see the impact of that now for a number of weeks, I think.
All right, David Coletto, always a pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Peter.